Good night. My name is Brianna Jones, and tonight I will be speaking about popular religion Haitian voodoo, demonic or dynamic. So, this topic, demonic or dynamic, brings me into my thesis, which is to explore how the popular religion of Haitian voodoo has always been casted in a negative light, associating the religion with stuff like Satanism, extreme sacrifices, and witchcraft. However, Haitian voodoo is wholeheartedly misunderstood and has made a number of positive influences in the lives of those who practice it, such as bringing a sense of ethnic belonging, bringing the community together, and also placing women in leadership roles. Hashtag feminism. So, before we could talk about the positive influences of Haitian voodoo, we must first figure out what is Haitian voodoo. And it is a religion first created by the slaves of Saint Dominique, now known as Haiti, during the 16th and 17th century, and their primary goal was to serve the Sevi Lua, which means serve the spirits. And in return, they would receive protection, health, and favor. So here I have a few of the gods or spirits that the Haitian slaves would serve. So the first one I have is Papa Legba, and he is the communicator between the human and the spiritual realm. We have Baron Samurai, which is the god of death, and then we have Erzuli, which is the god of beauty and love. So now that we know what Haitian voodoo is all about, we can now move into one of its first positive influences, which is a sense of ethnic belonging. And in the late 16th century, Haiti, formerly known as Saint Dominique, held hundreds of thousands of African slaves. Now, these slaves outnumbered their owners by almost 3 to 1. But even though these slaves outnumbered their white owners, they were still treated very cruelly, suffering from abuse, being overworked, infanticide, and even forced abortions. So here we see two pictures of slaves being abused, one hanging from a tree, half naked, and one with bruises on their back from being whipped. So this is where Haitian voodoo becomes an influential part inside of the slaves' lives, as in their regular lives, slaves were oppressed and submissive, but in spirituality, there is mutual benefits and feelings of empowerment. And this feeling became influential in the eventual French Revolt in the late 18th century. Voodoo also served as a reason for slaves to gather in groups, which means a means of planning plot revolts against their cruel masters, which they were able to successfully do. Therefore, the kin of these slaves can always reflect on voodoo being one of the key elements in empowering and gathering the slaves to their eventual freedom. And an interesting fact, at least what I found so interesting about Haitian voodoo, was the fact that it is said to be derived from one of the most popular and quote unquote holiest religions, which is Catholicism, as it is said that Catholicism, that Haitian voodoo is Catholicism overlaid on African spirituality. So now we can move over to the second point, and this is Haitian voodoo brings the community together. From the very inception of the religion, it was pivotal that the slaves stayed together, as numbers were their strength, along with their ability to depend on each other. Therefore, even after slavery, unity within the community was still and remained important. Thus, voodoo members had to follow a code of conduct, especially those who were acting as priests and priestesses, which is those who was basically speaking or serving the spirits or the gods. So, with the code of conduct, there was a communal emphasis and a respect for your elders. So, the communal emphasis basically meant that patients had to have the ability to depend on each other. So, for example, it is taboo to not take good care of your children, even if they are of an independent age. So it's not like in America when you reach a certain age, it's time for you to move out of your parents' house. They do not practice that within the Haitian voodoo religion. It is basically where you get to stay inside of your parents' home until you are ready to move on. So whether that's 15 or 50, you get to stay. And also they were very together when it came to being neighborly. So it was almost as if your neighbors were your family, and this was also a part of the code of conduct. So therefore, if one was missing, let's say, if one was missing a bowl of rice and needed a bowl of rice, they could go over to their neighbors, they could ask, and the neighbors would give it to them. So it is unlike many other religions that we see, which can be very cold. Their religion is very, very warm and welcoming. And it is also um, influential or necessary that you keep up these practices because if the code of conduct is broken, one can risk being denied by a lua or a spirit, which is the very basis of the Haitian voodoo religion. So it is of dire need that you are able to communicate with the spirits. Now we move into our final point or our final positive influence of Haitian voodoo, which is placement of women in leadership roles, which I like to say hashtag feminism. So Haitian voodoo differs from other religions like Catholicism, Anglicanism, and even Islam, as these religions don't allow women to have dominant roles. And even today, even with society changing, many of these religions, especially Catholicism, you're not allowed as a woman to have a prominent role within the church. But this is not the case with Haitian voodoo. With Haitian voodoo, women are allowed to have dominant or influential roles within their church. So an example is that I can use is Mama Lola. And Mama Lola, who was pregnant at the age of 14, years later became a voodoo priestess. And with her position, she became a religious leader, a guide, a spiritual healer, and communicated with the Lua or the spirits. So even though she was a woman, she performed a high position and she performed very, very well as she is extremely popular and can be found also with the makings of several books that speaks about her her experience within the voodoo community. So basically, there was no sexism with Haitian voodoo and everyone was equal. Overall, based on the evidence, it can be concluded that there is some level of miscomprehension and ignorance from outsiders who continue to degrade and spread rumors about the religion. But despite the many positive influences, it can also be said that the religion can be used for negative purposes, as most religions can. For example, Christianity. This was used as an excuse to wipe out an entire population in the Columbus era and was also used in efforts to brainwash the slaves into being more submissive to their cruel white owners. Therefore, I believe that any religion can be misconstrued. So why should we further degrade the religion of Haitian voodoo just because it's different? So we know that Haitian voodoo has various positive impact, like influencing the revolt that led to many slaves being free, or channeling that empowering energy from females, or bringing family and neighbors together. And with all this being said, I would like to ask you a question. Do you think Haitian voodoo is demonic or dynamic? Thank you.